Welcome to Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda. I'm Nick Park and I'm teaching a series of messages on Jesus in the Old Testament. It's actually based on a book I wrote 9 years ago called 40 Days with Jesus in the Old Testament. But as I'm sharing these in these Take 5s, it's taking me more than 40 days because I tell you that I'm finding myself 2 or 3 or 4 messages in one Old Testament book, because as I've already said, Jesus is not just in every book of the Old Testament, but he's on every page of the Old Testament, because he is the great theme of the Bible and he is the key for understanding the Bible. He is the lens through which we must read Scripture, both New Testament and Old Testament. And we've now reached the book of Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy literally means the second law. Now, of course, back in the Old Testament, there was one law, but it had to be given twice. There had to be a second law giving. And the reason is that in the book of Exodus, God gave the 10 Commandments through Moses, the lawgiver. God gave the 10 Commandments and the law of Moses. The problem was the entire generation that received that law on Mount Sinai, they sinned by refusing to go into the promised land. They voted to remain outside the promised land, and an entire generation died during the wandering in the wilderness, all except Joshua and Caleb. And that's all in the book of Numbers, of course. And so you get to Deuteronomy, and now that generation has died out. There's a new generation, so they've got to be given the law again. So Moses gave them the law once more. That's why Deuteronomy means the second law. Now, the second law was still the first law. It was still the same 10 Commandments. It was still the same rules. It was still the same regulations given by God to mark them out as God's covenant people. But it could never be a perfect law because they kept breaking it. And because it had to be repeated again and again, it could never make them perfect. And so it needed a better law, and it needed a better lawgiver. And Jesus is that better lawgiver, because he came to bring the royal law of love, as it's described in James chapter 2, verse 8, which is love your neighbour as yourself. But in Deuteronomy, Moses foretold that another prophet would come, a prophet greater than him. Now, when we get to the New Testament, people didn't really want to call this the prophet greater than Moses. They just said the prophet like unto Moses. It seemed almost blasphemous to suggest that this new prophet could be greater than Moses. But of course, Jesus was much greater than Moses. Now, Moses said another prophet would come, and so the people were waiting for that. And that's why when John the Baptist appeared, people said to him, "Are you that prophet?" And he said, "No." But then Jesus comes along, and as we know, when he said to his disciples, "Who do men say that I am?" one of them was the prophet like unto Moses. And whenever he fed the 5,000 in John chapter 6, we're told that people, because they had now been fed by Jesus in the same way that the Israelites were fed by the manna through Moses, they began to say, "Is this the one? Is this the prophet that Moses said would come? The prophet not just like unto Moses, but the prophet greater than Moses?" And the answer, of course, was yes. Jesus was that prophet, but he was still better than what they expected, because they just expected somebody that was going to come and meet their needs and feed them and help them beat the Romans. But Jesus came with something so much more, because if that's all he was going to be, then there would be no point Moses prophesying about him way back in the book of Deuteronomy. But Jesus was coming not just as a greater prophet, but the greatest prophet, our prophet, our priest, and our king, as prophesied by Moses in the book of Deuteronomy. And I'm so glad that Jesus comes and he supersedes and fulfills everything that came before him, because everything that came before him was imperfect. Everything that came after him in the New Testament was imperfect, but Jesus is perfect. And for that, we give him the glory. God bless you today. Join us again tomorrow for another Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda.